Let's take a look at how networks are disruptive. And to do that, we'll have to understand what are the markers of disruption. I believe there are three key markers that generally precede the adoption of any significant innovation. And it's especially true for that of networks. And the reason to do this is we want to be able to spot this ahead of time, before the masses, before it becomes obvious. And it's really just an exercise in pattern recognition. So let's walk through those three things, and we'll apply it to Bitcoin as the example. Here they are. So we have catalysts. So Bitcoin was certainly born from a catalyst. Initially, disruptive innovations are perceived as a novelty. Very much toy-like. They're not taken seriously by the public. And the last piece is FUD. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which could come from incumbents or concerned citizens. So let's look at how Bitcoin has tracked these over time. So firstly, a catalyst, it's something that kickstarts a reaction, but it isn't a reactant itself. So societally speaking, catalysts, can alter the current set of incentives resulting from some form of behavioral change. Now, Bitcoin was born out of a major catalyst of the 21st century, and that was the global financial crisis. And we know this because Satoshi placed a message in the Genesis blog referencing a headline about the bailouts that were being received by various financial institutions in the wake of the financial crisis. The next point, novelty. So we misunderstand new technologies. Let's be honest here. We never fully understand or appreciate how a new technology may be used in the future. We can't. Its usefulness isn't always immediately apparent. And many of Bitcoin's future use cases won't be understood or actualized until the innovation meets a wide enough level of adoption. And we get to see how people choose to use it and choose to innovate with it. So early on in the adoption curve of new technologies, the user experience is often lacking. Bitcoin certainly faced this hurdle with early user interfaces, nomenclature and standards yet to be refined. But with time, usability improves, adoption grows, feedback precipitates, and it evolves. And a helpful concept in how we misperceive the development of new technologies, something you may want to look into, is a concept called Amara's Law. And you can find this concept in your copy of the Bitcoin Handbook if you're interested. But the general point is this. Amara's Law explains how we naturally assume the impact of a technology will be linear. That's how we generally think as humans. We have a very hard time wrapping our heads around exponential change or volatile impact, which history shows that technology is anything but linear. That's the cognitive trap we fall into, is overestimating a technology in its infancy and then underestimating it as it matures and scales. The final point on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Here are a handful of headlines I pulled from major publications on Bitcoin. And opposition, criticism, skepticism to new innovation, it can come from various directions. It can come from the concerned citizen, it can come from a cynic, or it can come from a threatened incumbent. Now, the latter group is the group with the most to lose, and it's often the most vocal as a result. So having a deep vested interest in the continuity of an existing system for relevance, power, or resources, it'll create an enemy of any potential innovation that could pose a future threat. Let's take a look at a quick case study because this is a really interesting one. And the example I've got here is Ethernet. So Ethernet is a networking technology developed in the 1970s, and it greatly reduced the number of wires required to link computers. It got the number of wires all the way down to one. So today, Ethernet, it's an integral part of how many of us access the internet, and it's used every day in things from F-16 jets to, there are some aboard the International Space Station. However, it faced strong opposition in its infancy, despite all the significant benefits. Here's a quote from Bob Metcalfe, the co-inventor, explaining the reality of challenging these massive incumbents. I'll just read it for you now. IBM and General Motors opposed Ethernet, both of them with their own network technologies. the attacks on Ethernet during the 10 years that we tried to standardize it were vicious. These guys kept inventing theories showing that Ethernet can't work, but we had thousands of them deployed and they were working just fine. And yes, this is the same Bob Metcalfe immortalized through Metcalfe's law, and we'll get into network effects in a little bit. But you can see that competition between closed proprietary networking technologies and open ones like Ethernet, you can see how that was playing out. So this opposition to new technologies is not new. It goes back centuries. And the most well-known example is that of the Luddites. These were named after a fictional character called Ned Ludd. And this is back in the early 1800s. And this was workers who were concerned about being replaced by the mechanized loom. So a group of British weavers and textile workers, they took to destroying the machinery in protest. So before we move ahead to looking at network effects, we should look at how innovation takes place at the actual level of the protocol. So in the packaging of the information or the construction of a message. Here is the printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg in 1450. And Gutenberg created the press, or was able to create the press, because there were a host of other technologies available at the time that he could then combine. So we have 4 listed at the top there, the first being eyeglasses, which enabled people to read with magnification. That meant you could actually print a book with text small enough that you could, essentially compress data, if you think of it that way. The next piece we have is the wine press. So that was adopted as a way to transfer ink to the pages. Pulp and paper. So obviously, if you're going to be engaged in the production of books, there needs to be some kind of, manufacturing of pulp and paper to feed into the printing of books. And lastly, metal casting. So this was really important because it allowed individual characters to be forged that could then be rearranged to form different words, and they also wouldn't wear out if you were, say, using wood or some other material as the press. So what did this do? What was the point of Gutenberg's invention? Well, it basically standardized the protocol for packaging and disseminating information at scale. That was through the layout of pages in a printed book. So at this time, printed books worldwide, there were roughly 200 in the 1450s. But only 50 years later, there were an estimated 20 million. So an absolute explosion in the number of printed books worldwide. It certainly didn't stop there. The trend was just beginning. Pandora's box was now open, and the printing press was an innovation that heralded an explosion in the number of books because it took a painstakingly manual process and it automated much of it through mechanization. So this enabled scale, and the scale lowered the unit cost of each book. Correspondingly, we could see that was a sharp increase in literacy rates across Europe at the same time. I wrote an article kind of covering the printing press as an innovation. I'll link to it below. But the comparison I'm trying to highlight here is that Satoshi Nakamoto did a similar thing. Paradigm shifts come from the market forces that ensue as a result of an innovation. It's not some sort of top-down decree. And the recipe that this requires is it needs to be easy to replicate. And what Gutenberg and Satoshi did is they took already widely available pieces of technology and combined them in novel ways. So this makes it very difficult to shut down. It's kind of like Medusa. You shut down one printing press, well, another one could be built and operated somewhere else, which actually happened. And the same is true for a Bitcoin node. If we look at the white paper, we can kind of see some of those technologies that were brought together in a novel way to eventually result in the Bitcoin protocol. And the white paper, I like to think of it as a recipe. It kind of lays out how those puzzle pieces will fit together and interlock. So the printing press standardized the protocol for packaging and disseminating information at scale, Well, the Bitcoin protocol, that standardized packaging and validating information to enable digital value transfers at scale. So very similar in my mind. And once solved, that computer science problem that had eluded humans for many decades was creating a digitally scarce unit, which could then become, over time, native money of the digital age through its superior monetary properties. So now, getting on to network effects that I said we get back to, and this is important because it has to explain why networks get adopted and why they become more useful over time once you reach a critical threshold of users. So here's a quote from Peter Thiel, and he's explaining why a particular technology gets adopted. As a good rule of thumb, proprietary technology must be at least 10 times better than its closest substitute in some important dimension to lead to a real monopolistic advantage. Now, I know Peter Thiel's talking about proprietary technology, and we were talking about open source technology in relation to Bitcoin, but the general principle still holds. This is the 10x rule. Something needs to be 10 times better to convince someone to put up with the switching costs and the friction required to move to a new network. And Metcalfe's law, so this describes the growth in terms of the potential connections. So with each additional participant, well, the number of potential connections you have grows exponentially. So one is linear and the other is non-linear. So there's exponential growth with the addition of each marginal user. Again, this is in the Bitcoin Handbook if you want to read in a bit more detail about network effects. But here's a nice illustration that kind of hammers home the relationship between connections and the number of participants in a network, or nodes in the case of Bitcoin. To wrap up, here is a quote from a prolific Bitcoin educator and author, Gigi. And he says, "Money is a network. Some networks are singular, winner takes all, and money is such a network." And we're going to leave it there because we will get into what Gigi means in another video.